This is an exclusive presentation from Federated Media. Unholstered.
It is time for another edition of Unholstered. Welcome back. Hopefully you're having a fantastic weekend and you are staying cool. We're fighting off the excessive heat just like you are. And by we, I mean Sophia and I. My name is Kayla Blakesley. I am just one of your hosts here on Unholstered.
And good morning, everyone. This is Sophia Rosales-Catina, captain with the Fort Wayne Police Department. Welcome back to the show.
So Sophia is all about representing the local law enforcement side of things. I'm here to represent the local media side of things. Together we share and tell the stories that don't often get told when it comes to law enforcement. Speaking of, Sophia, what's it really like walking around with a heat index of about 100 degrees wearing all of that stuff that you have on right now? Like, you've got your full-on uniform. I can tell you've got a bulletproof vest on. Yep. You're carrying your firearm. Does that add so much extra?
It's awful.
Yeah.
Awful. Especially when the humidity really gets to you, because these vests do not breathe. So you just sweat underneath them.
And they're
like
heavy
you would
to
not
begin
believe.
with.
Yeah, I mean, you get used to it. And, you know, that's why we like to spend time in our cars, because it's air conditioned. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you unsnap the vest or unvelcro the vest and you kind of let it cool off in the air. But then when you get back out, I mean, and I wear glasses, and then my glasses fog up, so it's horrible.
So it's like extra layer of heat blanket.
Yeah, so I really feel bad for the officers in the street. Now I'm in my office most of the time, so it's not so bad for me. But I've worked it for years on the street in the heat, and it's terrible. Terrible.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing we did when you walked into the studio was put the AC on. So
I know,
you're welcome.
It's unbearably hot in here.
I will sit here and freeze so that you can be cool, Sophia. But no, as always, glad you're here with your expertise in the studio, because it's really going to come in handy today. I've entitled this episode, and you said these words, and I just stole it as the title. I've entitled this episode, Officer Down. We had a story here in our Fort Wayne area where there was an officer-involved shooting. Basically, this guy was robbing a home. The officer showed up on the scene. There was an exchange of gunfire. Both were okay, but both were also shot. They both sustained non-life-threatening injuries.
Yes.
So, you know, it just really kind of got me thinking about the whole process of what it looks like when an officer is shot, when an officer is involved in a shooting. And I was even driving into work this morning to record with you here, and there was a story about this young teenager throwing repeatedly all these knives at officers and managing to get a couple of the officers with the knives, if you know what I mean. They were okay, but they obviously returned gunfire, and they killed this teen. And they said, of course, an investigation is underway. So that got me thinking, too, like, what is the investigation different if it's a knife versus a firearm? I don't know. So I'm hoping we can go through all things involving, you know, Officer Down.
Yeah. First off, it's a very emotional time for everyone involved, even though, you know, we keep those in check as we're going through this process. So what happened just over a week ago was we had a burglary in progress. Officers showed up. They found two people exiting a home. There was gunfire exchanged. Both parties were hit, but the suspect had left on foot. So the officer was struck, and I remember exactly, I was at home. I just literally pulled, and I was taking off my boots, and my radio was still on, and I hear I'm shot.
Oh my gosh.
And it's one of my people southeast. It's one of my officers. So you kind of like, did I hear that right? Because, you know, it thankfully it doesn't happen with great frequency here. As a matter of fact, I couldn't remember the last time we had an officer shot, thankfully. But, you know, you kind of listen like, did I just hear that? And then, you know, the radio traffic that ensues after that, it's, you know, everyone just kind of just goes on a systematic play. Because we know we have a job to do. We know we have to get our officer. We have to get the medical aid. We have to look for the suspect. We have to contain the scene. We have to make sure that the house is clear, because we had two people exit. We don't know if that's all that's in there. So there's lots of things going on, and it's to listen to that and to listen to your people going through those motions like that so professionally. As a person who commands that quadrant, I'm just filled with like pride that everyone knew what they needed to do.
Yeah.
And they did it. And so from containing the scene to going through the house to looking for the suspect, lock down the area. And when they put out, when an officer goes down like that, we have a code called 154, which is named after an officer whose badge number was 154, who was, I believe, killed in the line of duty. So we use that moniker as that's like an officer needs assistance now. And literally the whole city, state, county, New Haven showed up for our officer. And that also, I get goosebumps right now just thinking about it, right? Goosebumps. Because that's what it means to wear this uniform. That's what it means to be in the thin blue line, is you have everybody at your ready when you need them. And he needed them at that time. So everybody filled this area and did what they needed to do. And that's what you want, right? And so our officer got taken to the hospital. We took us a bit to find the suspect. And I just want to say the fact that we have made inroads in community relations and we have relationships with our citizens here in this community was put on display then, because we got nothing but information, nothing but cooperation from people living in the area,
Sophia,
people calling in.
I feel like that doesn't always happen. Usually
I don't think it does. I don't think it does.
Yeah.
And especially in a highly minority community, there usually is like this.
Tight-lipped.
Yeah, and it's usually this, push-pull with law enforcement and the citizens, and it's not always great. And I'm not saying that it's 100% here, but we have made inroads here, and people trust us. And, you can see that with our homicide clearance rate. And now you see it with people just giving us information that's needed at the time to find this suspect.
It's amazing, actually.
Yeah, and, it's not lost on me but then we just had this whole police presence and the methodical way that we go about tracking people down. We moved. They were moving yard to yard and trying to find clear, because, we've got a potential shooter out there who just shot an officer. And if you're brazen enough to do that, you'll brazen enough to shoot anyone.
Absolutely.
So they went systematically through the neighborhood, over fences, in between crevices, looking through garages. It was just really methodical in how they moved about there. And we ended up getting him, and citizens were calling in, telling us, hey, there's this guy bleeding. I think he's shot, trying to get into cars. And so we'd run to that area and, couldn't find him when we were moving. And eventually we did catch up to the suspect.
Wow.
So I just want to thank our citizens for that. I don't think that sometimes they get enough thanks for helping us and giving us those tiny tidbits of info, because they really help us. They really help us in what we're doing. So, but again, our police department and the surrounding agencies, hats off to all of them for their hard work and dedication to find the shooter. And, he's in jail now on attempted murder charges, also has, I think, a machine gun charge because he had a switch.
Yes. We've talked a lot about those.
We talked about that before. So that's automatic gunfire. So, that's a fully automatic weapon. This could have ended horribly for us.
I say it's a wonder that the officer didn't have life-threatening injuries.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where you look back and it's like, wow, everything played out just as it should have. And, our officer is healing now. And
I feel like there's numerous scenarios I kind of want to work through with not even just particularly this story, but in any situation where an officer is shot. First and foremost, is this different because both individuals, you had the suspect and the officer both shot? Does an investigation and all of that still play out the same? Or is it different if just the officer was shot and not the suspect?
No, the investigation's somewhat still the same. Somewhat. So when an officer fires their weapon, we do have a shooting team that comes out.
Okay.
That team is comprised of internal affairs personnel, some patrol personnel, and they go through, and I think the firearms guys from the academy, because they really review everything after every shooting, policies, is this something that we've trained to? Is this something that we need to train to? Is this, did this
So that's
officer,
after any time an officer fires
anytime an officer
weapon.
discharges their weapon,
Wow.
the shooting team is called. And then those things go into action.
I guess it makes sense. I don't,
Yeah.
I don't know what I thought
Now
would
that
happen.
that investigation is separate from the criminal investigation. that goes on if, say, for instance, someone did die or obviously get injured if we actually hit someone, or if an officer gets shot. Those investigations are separate. And then there's two that run parallel. So we have an internal one that runs, and also the state police comes in and they run their own investigation as well. Because obviously we shouldn't be investigating for criminal charges either way, if the officer was wrong or, if the suspect has charges. So they run that investigation. We run ours for criminal charges for the quote unquote suspect civilian side. If there's criminal charges, those will come out of our agency.
Okay.
But they run an investigation on what we did. And, I hear a lot of people say, well, yeah, it's just police investigating police. I'm like, well, who's supposed to investigate it? If the police, it's a whole different agency. We have no say of what, how they interview or how they do things. Now, we have officers do still have rights, and they have an attorney present.
You just said it. It's also for best practices to some degree. It's also a learning experience. Like you just said, do we need to change moving forward? Do we need to adapt to this? Is this normal? Is this not normal?
Yeah.
So there's also that comes out of it. And I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, there's just a whole lot of things that go into it. And, like I said, people get upset with the process, but I don't know a different process. Mm-hmm. Who is supposed to investigate an officer-involved shooting? That goes on nationwide. So I don't know what other agencies do, but we always run those two parallel investigations on the state, and then we run our own.
Is that like that across the country, or is that per department?
It's per department policy. I don't know. What other agencies do. I think around here, though, like New Haven, Woodburn, the county, they all use that parallel investigation like we do. So this area right here, this county that we reside in, they're all very similar like that.
So, okay, let's say that, let's just use this example that we're talking about here. What if this suspect, this burglar, fired at this officer, but then the officer never fired at him? Does the investigation still look the same?
Not the shooting team would need to be called in.
No,
right? And neither would the state police.
Okay.
Because our officer did not engage. So that would just be a criminal investigation on the suspect's side. Yeah.
What about if a cop shoots you, hypothetically, and you didn't have a firearm, you were burglarizing a home, and I don't know, the officer thought you had a firearm or whatnot. What about that scenario? That
would play out just like an officer.
They bring the shooting team in.
So
okay,
there'd be a shooting team called. Anytime an officer discharges a weapon, the shooting team is going to be called. And most likely it's going to still be a state police investigation as well as our internal investigation.
So in this particular scenario with this burglar and both individuals shot, I mean, and I don't know if this officer's out of the hospital yet and back at work, back on the job. I don't know. But what is the policy essentially, though, for an officer that discharges their firearm? Is it different if the suspect dies or doesn't? What's the protocol with the officer?
The process is the same, no matter if the suspect is just injured or if they're deceased. So the process, investigation, and systems are the same because any time you discharge a weapon, the process is the same. Now, in that, so when we go, we have what we call a public safety statement. So the person in charge of the scene, which is normally a supervisor, sergeant, possibly a lieutenant, would come out and they'd read a pre-written public safety statement. So these are questions they're directly asking the officer about the incident, because we are responsible for every bullet that comes out of this gun. Mm-hmm. So we have to know immediately, how many times did you fire? Are they always right, and do they remember? No. Because again, this is a very highly emotional situation, and we're human too. So we might not remember. We may remember. I don't know. So we try to work in generalities here, and they may give us a number. They may say, I don't know, a couple times. They might guess.
Yeah. That could easily be like, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. You know?
And then we look at like, what direction did you shoot? What, those things that we need for immediacy, especially if you shot and we don't have a suspect there. If they may be injured, so we need to know, are we looking for someone? If they're deceased, then we know, we have all that stuff. Yeah. So these questions are really generated for public safety. So, because we have a shooter out there and they return fire, so we know we have someone we need to look for immediately that's homicidal at this point. So that's what that public safety statement is for. Now, officers are, all officers are covered with legal defense. So all our officers, patrol officers, are part of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, and they provide legal for the officer involved in any kind of incident like this, or any kind of internal affairs investigation. They have an attorney that makes the scene. Now, it's standard practice that we just read the public safety statement. The attorney signed off on that. The unions have signed off on that. We all know that that's what it is. They don't do a formal interview with the officer until 72 hours later. So it's just the public safety statement questions that are asked, and those are formal questions, and everyone's asked the same question. There's no deviation. Answers are written down, and then 72 hours later, they come back and they do their formal interviews. Now, you might be wondering, why 72 hours?
Yeah, could you see my mouth about to open?
Yes. And everyone asks that. And they've gone by the studies with this. So 72 hours is the sleep cycle that you need for the most recall of a situation. Huh. And that's backed by studies. So we adopted that policy because we want the most accurate playback. And I know people will be like, well, that's just to get their story together and all this stuff. I'm like, and citizens aren't afforded that. I'm like, citizens are afforded the opportunity to have a lawyer and not say anything at all. We are bound, if internal affairs comes to us, we are bound to answer those questions. We have a thing called Garrity that we rely on, that internal affairs can ask us those questions, but those answers cannot be used in a criminal proceeding. Those are just for policy stuff, and they may have ramifications here on my job, but they cannot be used in a criminal proceeding against me. Because you're making me answer something to keep my job. You can't hold that against me, then that's duress. That's what we would call duress. So that's why those statements are not able to be used. So
I had no idea.
Yeah, so there's a whole reason why, there's these investigations. Because imagine if you had to answer everything that someone asks you to keep your job, but then they're going to charge you criminally for it. I mean, nowhere else does that happen.
Mm-hmm. So, but what about the officer during that time? These questions being asked, the 72-hour second round of questioning, if you will, is the officer suspended at that time? Are they still able to work at that time? What does that look like? We put
all officers involved in discharging their weapon on administrative leave until that interview is done. Okay. And then they must, this is a must, there's no exceptions, they must see a psychologist in order to be cleared to come back to work.
Oh.
Because we need to know that they're fit for duty. Because these situations can be exceptionally emotional. Some people handle it just fine.
Like, no big deal. It's part of the job.
It's part of the job. There's just their mind or how their mind works. It doesn't make them heartless. It just means that they process this stuff differently. And then there could be someone who doesn't handle it as well and probably shouldn't be back out there, because if you're going back out there, there's always a potential to be in another shooting. And are you ready to defend yourself or someone else emotionally if you're coming off that other shooting? So they all have to be cleared by a psychologist that we do send them to. There's no exceptions to that.
Have you found yourself in this situation before?
I have not. I have been shot at, but I've never discharged my weapon. That situation was, I was just not in a
I might
position.
need some more information on that.
So we are trained, you have to know your target.
Oh, I think I remember this story now.
Yeah, I was in a hallway.
Yes.
I didn't have a target. My partner was at the doorway. He had, because they were shooting us through the door, he had that target through the door. I did not have it, and I wasn't going to go put myself in front of the door potentially to get shot, to get hit.
So I take it you didn't get shot through the wall or anything?
I don't know how. There were so many bullet holes through those walls. Grace of God. So,
Wow.
yeah. And neither one of us sustained any injuries. I mean, my partner had drywall and, wood splinters all over him from the stuff coming at him. He was like literally tucked in the frame of the doorway, turned to the side, just trying to suppress a fire until he could get to a safer place. Yeah. So very scary situation. But I'm not in a position. If I'd have shot, there were kids in that apartment.
You didn't have a target to even shoot at.
And
Gotcha.
how horrible would I feel at that point?
Right. So what about a scenario, kind of like the other one I mentioned earlier when we kicked off the show here? I'm driving into work today and talking about this teen with these knives. And forgive me because I don't have the full background of the story. I was kind of half asleep, admittedly, when I was driving in. But I heard the fact that he was throwing knives at officers. Officers ended up firing and shot and killed him.
Yeah.
So is there any difference with since there's two differing weapons in that scenario, are still all the same because the officer discharges firearm and it makes no difference for I'm going to say victim in this scenario, the suspect, the victim. But what if his charges, had he lived, would they have been different because it was knives and not a gun?
No, the statute doesn't differentiate between a gun unless you're looking at gun charges for like felon in possession of a handgun,
Gotcha.
something like that. The mechanism
That makes sense.
Yeah, so it'd still be like criminal recklessness or attempted murder with a knife, or depending on what the actions were of the suspect. And the knives to the gun thing does not make any difference for us. They're both deadly weapons. And like we talked before, if you're inside this area, I can quickly be killed with a knife if someone is proficient, even if they're not proficient. I mean, they get one strike. And like I said before, knives, these vests do not protect against sharp instruments like that. It'll go right through. So,
not to mention, there's plenty of other areas on your body that's not even
sure. I mean, you could
protected
get cut
by the vest.
Yeah, and you could get caught in the arm, and it's a femoral artery. You could bleed out.
Your neck,
your face, all of it. So, knives are just as dangerous for everyone as guns are. Now, can you get off more rounds at a distance? Yes, with a gun, absolutely. But if someone's in close proximity to you with a knife, and your reaction time, and we always say action is faster than reaction. So if someone's coming towards me and kind of immediately started running towards me, by the time I draw my weapon and fire, they could be on me and already stabbing me, because my reaction time is not as good as their action.
You started off this episode by saying, that we're very thankful that we don't have many officer-involved shootings here in the Fort Wayne area. Do you know how we compare to other departments across the state, across the country?
Well, we don't have as many officers that are shot. We do have our fair share of officer-involved shootings.
Yes, you're correct. Right,
but
fair point.
our
Thank you for the
officers have not
clarification.
been a victim of a perpetrator's gun. Now, we've shot a few people over the years that have had weapons, that have had knives, those kinds of things. I just got back from the Fraternal Order of Police State Conference, and we put 5 roses into the bucket for our memorial service, which indicates we've had 5 line of duty deaths that in the past year. So we've had 5 officers. Now, they weren't all killed with gunfire,
Right.
but they did die in line of duty. So we have our fair share of death in this area in Indiana. But in our area here, it's been a while since we've had an officer shot. Now, New Haven has had a couple of officer-involved shootings, and they've been not involved with knives. So, like I said, knives can be just as deadly.
How often is an officer found guilty of, I don't know, homicide, of attempted murder?
On a shooting, it's not very frequent. And I know people are thinking, well, it should be more. I'm like, there's a lot of Supreme Court rulings in the past, and we've talked about it here about having hindsight and, oh, well, you should have known. I'm like, I didn't know at the time. I could only go with the information I had at the time. And this is what I knew, and this is what I thought to be the instance. Now, sure, you can go up and like, oh, well, I should have known this or I should have known, but you can't. I'm not a fortune teller.
Right.
I don't know what people are going to do, what they're not going to do. I don't know necessarily the age of someone doing this. And people's like, it was just a child. I'm like, a child can be deadly as well. We've seen that with school shootings.
Yes, we have.
We've seen that with just children involved, and we've had perpetrators as young in this country as long as 8 and 9 years old killing people. Mm-hmm. So it's not the age. That's not anywhere in our policies.
And again, I still don't even understand how in that split-second moment you're supposed to know someone's age and why that's even relevant in that moment.
Yeah.
That's kind of
and
silly.
it's
That's
not.
silly
It's
to
just
me.
the danger they're presenting to the public. Now, I'm sure, and I'm sure I'm not going to be out of place speaking, but any time, regardless if it needed to be done or not, I can't imagine how an officer would feel killing a child.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine. Because we all have children.
Right.
Most of us have children, and a lot of them are that age. And, so that'd be really difficult. I mean, adults, because at that age, they've had something gone wrong in their life,
Right.
and they're just not brought up right. And then you see adults, I just have a lot more easier time digesting than I would a child.
Yeah.
That does things. So there's nothing in our policy that differentiates between our actions with a child versus an adult. If they pose a threat with a deadly weapon, then what we do is the same.
Well, Sophia, I hate to end on that note, but like usual, we're up against the clock. So I would encourage listeners, if they have more questions about officer-involved shootings or even the scenario of policy and things that happen afterwards, maybe wanting to know more about the investigations, to text us. We do have a new text line, 260-447-1190. That is the number to text us here at Unholstered, 260-447-1190. And really, if you have time, especially want to hear more about those switches, Sophia and I, we've done a whole episode on that. You can download the Unholstered podcast anywhere you download a podcast. Your town, your team, your topics. This is Unholstered.
Thanks for listening to Unholstered. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search Unholstered.
Podcasts by Federated Media.